I think GLAAD has had a unique role in the LGBT movement for always having been on the cutting edge. I mean, even in the context of marriage, we were one of the first states in Massachusetts in 2003 for the rights of gay couples to marry, and now you can see what seemed impossible victory in 2003 now seeming almost inevitable in 2015. And I think that's kind of the theme of our work going forward, is what are kind of those impossible dreams we can think of right now that we can make inevitable in 5, 10, 15 years. And so, I kind of like to think a lot about youth as one example because it's such important area of, and particularly the most vulnerable section of our community. We've worked so much on protecting youth in schools through anti-bullying laws, which are really important, but shouldn't that be the bare minimum? Shouldn't that be a given that a young LGBT person can go to school without being beat up? Instead, can we imagine a world that we can create where all students had to learn about LGBT history in their history classes, learned about the movement, learned about Harvey Milk and Frank Kameny and all the people who've come over many generations to bring us where we are today? If we can achieve that, think about the impact it would have for the next generation of young people, both LGBT and non-LGBT. So that's just one example, but I think it really shows how much bigger we can dream in terms of creating a just and affirming world for everyone. So in the context of youth, there is a lot of education to be done because I think there's still a lot of discomfort about talking about issues of sexuality and gender identity with young people. And we know that young people are coming out younger and younger, and that's the reality, and they all need to be supported. So one initiative that GLAAD has right now is to increase the number of gay-straight alliances, or GSAs, in middle schools. So we actually, there's a lot of work still to be done in high school. About 50% of high schools in Massachusetts, where GLAAD is located, have GSAs, but only 8% of middle schools have GSAs. And we know that having a GSA in your school is both creates and it also reflects a more protective, affirming environment for those youth. So we've started a campaign where we're encouraging younger middle school students to create GSAs in their schools, and if they encounter any resistance, GLAAD is there to support them in their efforts. And if it leads to litigation, then there's this added side benefit of actually establishing the legal rights of middle school students to create GSAs, which currently is not clearly stated in the law. So I think there's a lot that we can do in schools through GSAs for sure. But I also just want to touch upon the work of even the most vulnerable youth in our society, and those are out-of-home youth. We know that 40% of LGBTQ youth, or 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ identified. LGBTQ youth are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice and the foster care systems. Systems that are often unsupported, unfriendly to their identities. And so when we think about youth, we have to think as broadly as possible and make sure we're not leaving anyone behind. Well, with regards to anti-discrimination protections, particularly in the context of employment, first, going back to the education issue, there is so much education we need to do, even amongst people in our own community. Most people I speak to are shocked to find out that in over half the states in this country, you can still be fired, evicted, or kicked out of a restaurant for being gay or transgender. And we don't have the federal protections, and in half the states we don't have the state protections. GLAAD actually has 2 cases right now to try to build upon existing sex discrimination protections under Title VII in order to include lesbian and gay employees. Now, Title VII sex discrimination protections have been very successfully used to include transgender employees in a number of federal and appellate courts. It hasn't had the same progress for lesbian and gay employees, but it makes total sense and it's right. If you fire someone for being gay, you're firing that person for being attracted to or in a relationship with somebody of the wrong sex. We have a case right now against Walmart, where Walmart refused to provide spousal health insurance benefits to our client, Jackie. for her spouse D. And unfortunately, D was diagnosed with breast cancer, was uninsured, and they racked up over $100,000 in medical bills. Now, if Jackie had been a man, she would have gotten those benefits, but because she's a woman, she didn't. Now, that's clear-cut sex discrimination to us, and we hope the courts agree. Sure. Well, litigation is actually a great vehicle for education because what we know is that the public can understand and really sympathize with stories of harm. And when you have litigation, you generally have a plaintiff who's harmed. And so we always try to, when appropriate, use our plaintiffs as a way of educating. And I think in some ways, the religious right, in trying to create these carve-outs in our anti-discrimination laws for religious liberty and beliefs, is actually in many ways putting the face of that discrimination front and center for Americans. What happened in Indiana with individual business owners saying they wanted the right to discriminate against gay and lesbian people did more than I think any of us could have done to actually educate the mainstream of America that yes, discrimination is still alive and well in this country, and it hurts an enormous number of people. Well, there's a lot, and again, GLAAD's agenda really is to, one, make sure that the legal victories that we've made actually make a real difference in people's lives, that they're not just words in a book. And so when you look at those communities, those are often the most vulnerable: our youth, our elders, transgender individuals, low-income individuals, people in communities of color. So there's a broad range of work still to make sure that everyone is lifted up by our victories. I'll just highlight the work that GLAAD is doing in the transgender rights area. We're making enormous progress with regards to healthcare access and insurance coverage for transition-related healthcare, getting transgender people the ability to receive accurate identification documents. And while I love to talk about GLAAD's victories, I also think this is really important to talk about our losses as well too, because that's what really drives our work going forward. And GLAAD actually just lost a case in the First Circuit on behalf of a transgender inmate, Michelle Kostelik, who had been fighting a 20-year battle with the Department of Corrections for medically necessary, life-saving gender affirmation surgery. And if you read the decision by the First Circuit, you'll see how that court really twisted the standard of review that it should have been applying to the district court's opinion, which affirmed her need for this surgery. The district court, who sat through a 28-day trial and listened to dozens of witnesses and came to the conclusion that this was constitutionally required medical care. On review, the First Circuit unfortunately decided to retry the case simply because of who our plaintiff was. And in this case, our plaintiff was a transgender inmate. And so I think that really highlights how much more work we still have to do, both in the courts and in public education.